The massive hall of the Spiral Arm space station buzzed with excitement. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy gathered around floating screens, their eyes fixed on the ancient armor displayed in the center of the testing chamber. It stood tall and proud on its pedestal, its surface gleaming with an otherworldly shine that seemed to shift between colors like oil on water. Admiral Root stood at the podium, his weathered face serious as he addressed the crowd. For 1,000 years, the Maker's armor has been the greatest mystery in our galaxy. Today, we begin another attempt to find its chosen bearer. In the back of the crowd, a maintenance engineer named Jack Stone cleaned the environmental control panel, half listening to the speech. He'd heard the legend countless times during his 3 years working on the station. The armor, created by an ancient race known as the Makers, was said to be indestructible and possessed its own consciousness. It had rejected every warrior who tried to claim it since its discovery. The rules remain unchanged. Admiral Root continued, his voice echoing through the hall. Any being may attempt to bond with the armor. However, be warned, those deemed unworthy face rejection, and some have not survived the experience. Jack wiped his hands on his gray coveralls and moved to the next panel. The crowd's murmuring grew louder as the Admiral described the upcoming trials. Warriors from every corner of the galaxy would arrive over the next week, each believing they would be the one to finally claim the legendary armor. The first candidate arrived that very afternoon, a warrior from the Crystal Worlds, his body formed of living crystal, approached the armor with confident steps. The gathered crowd held their breath. The crystal warrior reached out, his translucent hand almost touching the armor's surface. Nothing happened. The warrior tried again, pressing his hand firmly against the armor. Still nothing. After several more attempts, he stepped back, his crystalline features twisted in confusion. The armor requires more than just physical strength, explained Professor Green, the station's chief historian. She stood near Jack as he worked, her voice carrying the weight of decades of research. The Makers were master craftsmen who built wonders we still can't understand. Their armor wasn't meant for simple combat. Jack nodded politely, focusing on replacing a faulty sensor, but he found himself wondering about the Makers as he worked. The few remnants of their civilization showed technology far beyond anything currently known. They had built machines that could reshape planets, yet they had vanished without explanation, leaving only mysteries like the armor behind. Over the next few days, more warriors arrived, each one more impressive than the last. A being made of pure energy, capable of destroying stars. A warrior poet who had memorized the histories of 1,000 worlds. A living quantum computer in humanoid form. The armor rejected them all. Jack watched between repair jobs as warrior after warrior failed. Some left quietly, others raged against their rejection. A few had to be carried away by medical teams, their bodies and minds strained by whatever test the armor had subjected them to. One evening, as Jack repaired a damaged light panel near the testing chamber, he overheard 2 guards talking about the armor's latest rejection. "Did you see what happened to that quantum being?" the first guard asked. "The armor didn't just reject him, it shut down all his processes. Took the medical team 3 hours to restart his systems. I heard the armor actually spoke to him," the second guard replied. "Told him he was too rigid in his thinking, or something like that." Jack's hands stopped moving as he listened. He'd never heard of the armor speaking to anyone before. The ancient records suggest the armor does communicate. Professor Green's voice made Jack jump. She had a habit of appearing silently beside people, but not in words. It shares impressions, feelings, sometimes memories. The Makers believed in understanding through experience rather than explanation. The professor adjusted her glasses and looked at Jack thoughtfully. "You know, you remind me of how the Makers are described in the oldest texts. Always fixing, always improving, always trying to understand how things work." Jack laughed. "I'm just a maintenance engineer, Professor. The Makers built things that still amaze us thousands of years later. I just keep the lights on and the air flowing." Perhaps she said with a mysterious smile. That's exactly what they would have appreciated. The next morning brought more candidates and more rejections. A warrior from the gas giants, able to change his body's density at will. Rejected. A master of theoretical physics who claimed to understand the fundamental forces of the universe. Rejected. A being who had evolved beyond physical form entirely. Rejected so strongly the testing chamber had to be evacuated for decontamination. Admiral Root called an emergency meeting of the station's senior staff that evening. Jack was there to fix the meeting room's hologram projector, which had been acting up lately. "We're running out of options," the Admiral said, pacing the room. "The greatest warriors in the galaxy have tried and failed. Some are suggesting we should seal the armor away again, declare it too dangerous to continue testing." "That would be a mistake," Professor Green argued. "We're learning something from each rejection. The armor isn't looking for what we think it's looking for. It's not about power or knowledge or technological advancement." "Then what is it looking for?" Captain Wells asked, frustrated. "We've had beings here who could reshape reality itself, and the armor treated them like children playing with toys." Jack focused on the projector, trying to trace the source of the interference, but he couldn't help thinking about what he'd seen over the past week. Every warrior had approached the armor expecting it to recognize their greatness. None of them had tried to understand the armor itself. "The makers built things to last," he muttered to himself as he replaced a burnt-out connection. "They built things to be maintained, to be understood, to be improved." "What was that stone?" the Admiral asked sharply. Jack looked up, surprised to find everyone staring at him. "Oh, sorry, sir. Just thinking out loud. It's just... well, everything we found from the makers shows the same pattern. Their technology isn't just advanced. It's designed to be understood and maintained. Even their simplest tools teach you something about how they work while you use them." Professor Green's eyes lit up. "Yes, that's exactly right. We've been so focused on finding someone worthy of the armor, we haven't considered that the armor might be looking for someone worthy of the maker's legacy." The meeting erupted into discussion, but Jack had already turned back to the projector. He had work to finish, and warriors to watch fail tomorrow. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was starting to understand something important about the makers and their mysterious armor. Unknown to Jack, in the testing chamber below, the armor's surface rippled slightly, its colors shifting in a pattern that hadn't been seen in 1,000 years. The time of testing was coming to an end, but not in the way anyone expected. The legend of the maker's armor was about to change forever, and a simple maintenance engineer would be at the heart of it all. Jack's morning started like any other, with a broken pipe in the alien quarters. He knelt in front of the leaking coolant line, his tools spread around him as he studied the strange metal. The pipe was designed for beings from a high-pressure world, and its material could crush a human hand if mishandled. "Don't worry, Ambassador," he said to the worried floating sphere behind him. "I've fixed these before. The trick is to understand how the metal thinks." The Ambassador, a being made of compressed gas, pulsed with different colors. The translator pinned to Jack's collar converted the color patterns into words. "Thinks. Metal does not think. Engineer stone." Jack smiled as he carefully applied pressure to the pipe's surface. "Maybe not like you and me, but every material has its own way of doing things. This metal, it doesn't like sudden changes. You have to ease it into a new shape, like this." The pipe gradually bent back into its proper form under Jack's careful touch. The leak stopped, and the Ambassador's colors shifted to pleased purple tones. "Most interesting approach," the Ambassador commented. "Others have tried to force repairs. Always failed. How did you learn this?" "By making mistakes," Jack admitted, packing up his tools. "Broke 3 pipes before I figured out the right way. But each failure taught me something new." As Jack walked through the station's corridors, he passed more warriors arriving for the armor trials. They came in all shapes and sizes, some barely visible to the human eye, others so large they had to project avatars to fit in the station. All of them ignored the maintenance engineer in his worn gray coveralls. That suited Jack fine. He had 12 more repairs scheduled before lunch, including a tricky one in the testing chamber itself. The environmental systems there had been acting up ever since the quantum beam's rejection 3 days ago. When Jack arrived at the testing chamber, he found it empty except for the armor on its pedestal and Professor Green making notes on her tablet. "Morning, Professor," Jack called out as he opened the access panel. "Mind if I check the air recyclers? They've been running hot since Tuesday." "Go right ahead," she replied, not looking up from her work. "The next candidate isn't due for another hour. Some kind of temporal warrior who exists in multiple time streams at once." Jack whistled as he climbed into the maintenance shaft. "Sounds complicated. Hope they don't break anything if the armor rejects them. These systems are tricky enough to maintain as it is." He worked in comfortable silence for a while, only the soft hum of machinery and the occasional muttering from Professor Green breaking the quiet. The recycler's problems turned out to be more complex than he'd expected. Someone had tried to modify it to handle temporal particles, but they clearly didn't understand how the old systems worked. "Who's been messing with this?" Jack wondered aloud, tracing the new connections. "They've completely ignored the base harmonics. No wonder it's overheating." He spent the next 40 minutes carefully undoing the modifications and restoring the system to its original configuration. It was delicate work. One wrong move could flood the chamber with temporal particles. But Jack had learned to trust his hands and his understanding of how things work together. As he finished the final adjustments, he heard voices entering the chamber. The temporal warrior must have arrived early. "I exist in all moments simultaneously," a voice echoed through the chamber. "Past, present, and future are one to me. Surely the armor will recognize my mastery of time itself." Jack started packing up his tools, planning to slip out quietly through the maintenance exit. But as he reached for his wrench, it slipped from his fingers and fell, clattering against the metal floor below. The temporal warrior's many voices spoke as one. "Who dares interrupt my moment of destiny?" "Sorry," Jack called down, embarrassed. "Just finishing some repairs. Don't mind me." He climbed down from the maintenance shaft, keeping his eyes down as he retrieved his wrench. But something made him glance toward the armor, and what he saw made him freeze. The armor's surface was moving, shifting colors flowing across it like waves. In all the trials he'd watched, he'd never seen it react like this. The temporal warrior strode forward, his form flickering between different versions of himself. "Stand aside, maintenance drone. This is a moment for warriors, not servants." But Jack couldn't move. The armor's colors were forming patterns he recognized. Maintenance codes, repair sequences, system diagnostics. They were the same patterns he sought every day in his work, but impossibly complex and beautiful. Professor Green gasped. "The armor, it's responding." The temporal warrior reached for the armor, his multiple forms converging into one moment of perfect temporal alignment. But before he could touch it, the armor's surface flashed with a brilliant light that filled the chamber. When the light faded, the temporal warrior was gone, or rather, he was scattered across multiple time streams, his forms no longer synchronized. He flickered out of the chamber in confusion, his carefully planned moment of destiny ruined. "Fascinating," Professor Green muttered, furiously taking notes. "It didn't just reject him, it actually adjusted his temporal frequency. But why? And why now?" Jack finally managed to tear his eyes away from the armor. "I should go," he said quickly. "I've got a broken food synthesizer waiting for me on level 3. As he hurried toward the door, Professor Green called after him. "Jack, wait. Did you see how it was reacting? Those patterns." "Probably just a coincidence," Jack said over his shoulder. "I'm sure the next warrior will have better luck." But as he walked to his next repair job, Jack couldn't forget what he'd seen. Those patterns hadn't been random. They were a language he understood better than any spoken word. The armor had been showing him exactly how it worked, how all its pieces fit together. He shook his head, trying to clear it. He was a maintenance engineer, not a warrior. He fixed things that were broken, kept systems running, helped people solve problems. The armor wasn't meant for someone like him. Was it? The thought followed him through the rest of his shift, distracting him as he fixed the food synthesizer. It had tried to translate a recipe for temporal warrior food and gotten confused. Repaired a damaged translator. The ambassador's color speech had overloaded its visual processors, and cleaned up after a warrior made of pure mathematics had accidentally turned a corridor into a Klein bottle. That evening, as Jack sat in his small quarters reviewing repair requests for the next day, his tablet pinged with a message from Professor Green. The armor's energy readings changed today. They're different from anything we've seen before. Something is happening, Jack. Something important. Don't be late for your maintenance check tomorrow. Jack stared at the message for a long time before turning off his tablet and trying to sleep. But in his dreams, he saw those patterns again, flowing across the armor's surface like a maintenance manual written in light, showing him secrets that had been waiting 1,000 years to be understood. The morning of the final trials arrived with chaos. A warrior made of living lightning had shorted out half the station's systems during his rejection, leaving Jack with a mountain of repairs to handle. He rushed from deck to deck, fixing fried circuits and restoring power to critical systems. Stone. Captain Wells's voice crackled over his communicator. We need you in the testing chamber now. The environmental systems are completely dead, and we've got the last 5 candidates waiting. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead. On my way, Captain. Just let me finish stabilizing this power relay. The testing chamber was packed when he arrived. 5 of the most impressive warriors in the galaxy stood in a line, while Admiral Root addressed the gathered crowd. Jack slipped in through the maintenance entrance and made his way to the environmental control panel. The first warrior stepped forward, a being of pure thought who had transcended physical form. They appeared as a shimmering field of possibilities, each one representing a different path of logic and reason. As Jack worked on the environmental systems, he couldn't help but watch. The thought being approached the armor, their form rippling with complex equations and universal truths. I have solved the mysteries of dark matter, they announced. I have calculated the exact moment of the universe's birth. Surely, I am worthy. The armor remained still and dark, the thought being pressed closer, their field of possibilities trying to encompass the armor. Suddenly, their forms scattered like dust in the wind, reforming at the far end of the chamber. Impossible, they exclaimed. It gave me a maintenance puzzle, a simple repair challenge. Me, a being of pure thought. Jack's hands stopped moving on the control panel. A maintenance puzzle. That was new. The second warrior stepped up, a massive creature whose body was forged in the heart of a dying star. Heat radiated from their metallic skin as they approached the armor. I have survived forces that would crush planets, they rumbled. No armor could reject my strength. But before they could even touch it, the armor's surface rippled with familiar patterns. Jack recognized them instantly: cooling system diagnostics, heat exchange protocols, basic temperature management. The star-forged warrior staggered back, their mighty form cooling rapidly. What trickery is this? It shows me. Maintenance procedures. Professor Green was practically bouncing with excitement as she recorded everything. But Jack forced himself to focus on his work. The environmental systems were badly damaged, and if he didn't get them working soon, the chamber would become uninhabitable. The third warrior was a collective consciousness of 10,000 linked minds. They approached as one, their shared intelligence probing at the armor's mysteries. We are unity. They spoke with 10,000 voices. We are understanding made manifest. We will. The armor flashed, and suddenly all 10,000 minds were working independently, each trying to solve a different repair problem. The collective consciousness withdrew in confusion, their perfect unity disrupted by practical challenges. As Jack finished repairing one system, he noticed something odd. Every time the armor rejected a warrior, the environmental systems changed slightly. It was subtle, power fluctuations, temperature shifts, air pressure variations, almost like it's testing my repairs, he muttered to himself. The fourth warrior was the most impressive yet, a being who had evolved backwards through time, experiencing the future as memory and the past as destiny. They moved with perfect grace, knowing exactly where to step because they remembered doing so. I have seen all ends, they declared. I know the armor's choice because I remember witnessing it. The armor's surface exploded with patterns more complex than any before. Jack gasped as he recognized them. They were maintenance sequences, but arranged in ways he'd never imagined. Solutions to problems he dealt with every day, but approached from completely new angles. The time-evolved warrior stumbled back, their memories suddenly uncertain. This is not what I remembered. It shows me repair protocols, maintenance logs. This is not the destiny I saw. Jack's hands moved faster on the control panel, adapting to the armor's changes, keeping the system stable. It was like a dance between him and the armor. It would alter something, and he would adjust, each change teaching him something new about how the systems work together. The final warrior stepped forward. They were different from the others, smaller, quieter, but with an intensity that made the air crackle. A problem solver, someone who had won victories through cunning rather than power. I understand, they said softly, looking at the armor. You're not looking for a warrior at all, are you? The armor's surface began to glow, patterns flowing faster and faster. Jack watched in amazement as maintenance codes he used every day merged with ancient symbols he'd never seen before, forming something new and beautiful. The final warrior reached out slowly, carefully, as if they were trying to repair something delicate. For a moment, it seemed like they might succeed where all others had failed. But the armor's glow faded, and its surface stilled. Another rejection, but gentler this time, almost apologetic. The warrior stepped back and turned to face the crowd. You're all looking at this wrong, they announced. This isn't a warrior's armor at all. It's something else entirely. Admiral Root stepped forward. What do you mean? The legends all speak of the Maker's greatest warrior. The legends are wrong, the warrior interrupted. Or maybe we just misunderstood them. This armor, it's not waiting for someone to use it. It's waiting for someone to understand it. Jack's hands froze on the control panel as the warrior's words sank in. All this time, through every trial, the armor hadn't been testing combat skills or special powers. It had been showing its inner workings, revealing how it functioned, waiting for someone who could see the patterns and understand what they meant. The crowd erupted in discussion, but Jack barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the armor, watching as tiny maintenance patterns flickered across its surface like a question waiting to be answered. Professor Green appeared beside him, her eyes bright with understanding. Jack, she said quietly, I think you need to step away from that control panel. But the systems are working perfectly, she finished. Better than they ever have, in fact. Because someone who understands them has been maintaining them. Someone who sees patterns and solves problems. Someone who thinks like the Makers did. Jack looked down at his hands, still resting on the control panel, then back at the armor. Its surface rippled once, almost like a greeting. And in its patterns he saw the solution to every repair he'd ever attempted, every problem he'd ever solved, and 1,000 more just waiting to be understood. The final trials were over. But something told him the real test was just beginning. The testing chamber fell into an uneasy silence as the last warrior's words hung in the air. Jack stood at the control panel, his hands trembling slightly as he felt hundreds of eyes turned toward him. The armor's surface continued to ripple with maintenance patterns, like a beacon calling out to him. Admiral Root was the first to speak. Engineer Stone, step away from that panel. But Professor Green stepped between them. No, Admiral. Look at the armor. Really look at it. It's been trying to tell us something all along, and Jack is the only one who's been listening. The armor's patterns grew brighter, flowing faster across its surface. Jack recognized system diagnostics, repair sequences, and maintenance protocols, all weaving together into something more complex and beautiful than he'd ever seen. "It's not just showing random patterns," Jack said softly, his voice carrying in the silent chamber. "It's teaching. Every rejection, every test. It was demonstrating how it works, how all its systems connect. It's been trying to find someone who wants to understand it, not control it." The Admiral frowned. "You're saying the legendary Maker's armor, the most powerful weapon in known space, has been looking for a maintenance engineer?" "Think about it," Professor Green urged. "Everything we know about the Makers shows they valued understanding above all else. Their greatest works weren't weapons. They were tools that taught you how to use them." Jack took a deep breath and stepped away from the control panel. As he did, the armor's patterns shifted, following his movement. The crowd gasped. "I spent the last week watching it reject the most powerful beings in the galaxy," Jack said. "But it wasn't rejecting their strength or their intelligence. It was rejecting their approach. They all tried to prove they were worthy of using it. None of them tried to learn from it." He took a step toward the armor. The patterns on its surface brightened, becoming more intricate. Jack could see how each system connected to the others, how power flowed through neural networks more complex than anything he'd ever worked on. "Stone, what are you doing?" Captain Wells called out. "My job," Jack answered simply, "finding out how things work and helping them work better." Another step. The armor's patterns were moving faster now, showing him details about its inner workings that made his mind spin. It was like looking at the most advanced repair manual ever written, one that adapted and changed based on the reader's understanding. A warrior made of living crystal stepped forward. "This is absurd. He's just a human maintenance worker. He can't possibly be worthy of." The armor flashed, and suddenly the chamber's walls were covered in flowing patterns. Jack laughed as he recognized them. "It's showing us how the station's systems work," he explained. "Look, there's the power grid, the life support, the gravity controls. It's all connected, all working together, just like how the Makers saw the universe." He took another step, and another. The armor's patterns synchronized with his movements, like they were in a dance of question and answer, problem and solution. 3 steps away. "The Makers didn't build weapons," Jack said, understanding flowing through him like an electric current. "They built teachers. Everything they made was designed to help others understand how the universe works." 2 steps. The armor's surface was a cascade of light and information now, showing him secrets that had been waiting 1,000 years to be shared. 1 step. "They weren't looking for the strongest warrior," Jack whispered. "They were looking for someone who would keep learning, keep understanding, keep fixing what was broken." He reached out, his hand hovering just above the armor's surface. In that moment, he saw everything. How the armor worked, how it could teach, how it could help him help others. But more than that, he saw what it wanted to become, not a weapon of war, but a tool of understanding. "May I?" he asked softly. The armor's surface stilled for a moment, and in the patterns that flickered across it, Jack read a response as clear as spoken words. "You already understand." His fingers touched the surface. Light exploded through the chamber, but it wasn't the harsh, rejecting blast that had thrown back so many warriors. This light was gentle, welcoming, like the glow of a problem finally solved. It flowed around Jack, and he felt knowledge pouring into his mind, not just about the armor, but about everything the Makers had understood about the universe. When the light faded, the armor had changed. It was no longer the rigid, imposing form that had rejected so many warriors. Instead, it had transformed into something that looked almost like his maintenance coveralls, but made of flowing, living metal that shifted and moved with his thoughts. "Impossible," someone in the crowd whispered. But Jack could feel it wasn't impossible at all. The armor had merged with him, not as a weapon, but as a partner. Through it, he could see how everything in the station worked together. Every system, every connection. every possibility for improvement. "How does it feel?" Professor Green asked, her voice full of wonder. Jack flexed his hands, watching as the living metal rippled with his movement. "It feels right, like I've been fixing things with only half the tools I needed, and now I finally have the full set." Admiral Root stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. "But what does this mean?" "The legend spoke of a warrior who would use the armor's power to make things better," Jack finished. "That's what the makers were really about. Not destroying, but understanding. Not fighting, but fixing." He looked around the chamber, seeing it with new eyes, seeing all the ways it could be improved, all the systems that could work better together. And there's so much work to do. The armor's surface rippled with agreement, patterns flowing like quicksilver as it adjusted to its new partner. After 1,000 years of waiting, it had finally found what it was looking for, not the strongest warrior, not the most powerful being, but someone who understood that the greatest power lies in the ability to fix what's broken and make things work better. The age of warriors was over. The age of understanding had begun. 3 months after the armor chose Jack Stone, the Spiral Arm space station had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Gone were the constant system failures and emergency repairs. The station now operated with an efficiency that amazed even its designers. Jack stood in his new workshop, the armor flowing around him like liquid metal as he studied a holographic display of the station's systems. The room was filled with broken devices from across the galaxy, each waiting to be understood and repaired. Engineer Stone, his communicator chimed. "The diplomatic delegation from the Crystal Worlds has arrived. They're requesting your assistance." Jack smiled. Word had spread quickly about the human maintenance engineer who wore the legendary Maker's armor. But instead of coming to challenge him as a warrior, beings from across the galaxy now sought him out for help with their most difficult technical problems. "On my way," he replied, watching as the armor shifted its patterns to match his thoughts. After 3 months, they worked together so smoothly that Jack sometimes forgot where he ended and the armor began. In the main diplomatic chamber, he found 3 crystal beings standing around a device that pulsed with unstable energy. Their crystalline forms flickered with worry. "The core regulator for our main city is failing," one explained. "None of our engineers can stabilize it. If it fails completely, millions will be affected." Jack approached the device, and through the armor's enhanced senses, he could see exactly how it worked. The patterns flowing across his suit matched the energy pulses of the regulator, showing him every flaw and potential solution. "The problem isn't in the power source," he said, kneeling beside the device. "It's in how the energy flows. See these patterns?" He pointed to the swirling energies. "They're like the maintenance systems in this station. Everything's connected. Everything affects everything else. You can't fix one part without understanding how it relates to the whole." As he worked, he explained each step to the crystal beings. The armor helped him translate complex engineering concepts into terms they could understand, just as it had helped him understand their technology. "There," he said finally, stepping back as the regulator hummed with stable power. "But the real solution isn't just fixing it. It's understanding why it broke and how to prevent it from happening again." The crystal beings' faces shimmered with gratitude. "You truly are what the legends promised," one said. "Not a warrior of destruction, but a warrior of understanding." Jack shook his head. "Not a warrior at all. Just someone who likes to fix things." Later that day, he found Professor Green in her office, surrounded by holographic displays showing data from the armor. "The more we study it," she said excitedly, "the more we realize we misunderstood the makers completely. They weren't building weapons for some great war. They were creating tools to help other species grow and learn. That's why the armor chose a maintenance engineer," Jack agreed. "It wasn't looking for someone to use its power. It was looking for someone who would use its knowledge to help others." The professor nodded. "And look at the results. In 3 months, you've solved technical problems that have stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy. But more importantly, You've taught others how to solve their own problems. Jack looked down at his hands, watching the armor ripple with maintenance patterns. That's the real power of the Maker's technology. It doesn't just work, it shows you how it works. Every repair is a lesson. Every solution teaches something new. A young alien engineer approached them, one of many who had come to the station to learn. The armor's patterns shifted slightly, and Jack knew it was already analyzing the technical problem the engineer wanted to discuss. Speaking of teaching, he said to Professor Green, "I have a class to get to." The teaching chamber was full when he arrived. Engineers and technicians from dozens of species sat ready to learn, their eyes fixed on the armor's shifting patterns. Jack had discovered that the armor could project its diagnostic displays large enough for everyone to see, turning every repair job into a lesson. Today, he began, we're going to learn how the Makers approached system integration. It's not about forcing different technologies to work together. It's about understanding how they want to work together. As he spoke, the armor displayed examples from repairs he'd done across the galaxy. The students watched in fascination as complex technical problems were broken down into understandable patterns. The Makers believe that everything in the universe is connected, Jack explained. Every system, every piece of technology, every being. They all affect each other. Once you understand those connections, you can fix almost anything. After class, Admiral Root found him in his workshop. The Admiral had changed in the past 3 months, his initial skepticism replaced by a deep respect for what Jack and the armor had accomplished. The Council of Worlds sent a message, he said. They want to know if you'll consider traveling to other stations, other worlds. There are problems out there that need your kind of understanding. Jack looked at the armor's surface, seeing his own thoughts reflected in its patterns. What do you think? He asked it silently. The answer came not in words, but in a flow of images showing worlds that needed help, systems that needed repair, and people who needed to understand. We'll go, Jack told the Admiral, but not as a warrior, and not alone. I want to take students with me, engineers and technicians who want to learn. The more people who understand how to fix things, the better the galaxy will be. The Admiral smiled. You know, when this all started, everyone thought the armor would choose the greatest warrior in the galaxy. Instead, it chose exactly what we needed most. Someone who could teach us how to make things better. That evening, Jack stood at the station's observation window, looking out at the stars. The armor's surface reflected the starlight, its patterns merging with the distant galaxies. 1,000 years, he said quietly. You waited 1,000 years to find someone who would understand what you really are. The armor's patterns shifted, showing him visions of the Makers, not as mighty warriors, but as teachers and builders who wanted to help the galaxy grow. They had created the armor not as a weapon, but as a way to pass on their knowledge to someone who would use it wisely. A maintenance alert chimed, and Jack smiled as he read it. Somewhere on the station, something needed fixing. The armor's patterns were already showing him what the problem might be and how they could solve it. Well, he said, turning away from the window, let's get to work. There's always something that needs fixing, always something new to understand. The armor rippled in agreement as they headed off to their next repair job. The legend of the Maker's armor had changed, but the new story was better than the old one. It wasn't a tale of war and power anymore. It was a story about understanding, about fixing what was broken, and about teaching others to do the same. As Jack walked through the station's corridors, the armor flowing around him like liquid starlight, he realized that some legends don't need warriors to make them great. Sometimes, all they need is someone who wants to learn, someone who wants to understand, someone who wants to make things work better. And in the end, that was the greatest power of all.